Hi, this last presentation for our infographic unit is going to be about visual elements. So at this point, we've already talked about how to find the research that's going to work well visually, making sure you have some graph, some chart as part of your infographic that's representing that data visually. But now we got to consider the rest of things, layout, color, things that have to relate with how you present your information in the most appealing way for your audience. Okay, so that's what this presentation is all about, the visual elements. Okay, so the first big thing to keep in mind is that less is more. Right, a really wordy graphic's hard to follow. Something like this with a lot of background space that's not full, so the language is easy to see, works really well. But as soon as you start putting in too many big chunks, and that's not to say you're not going to have any chunks of text, but once it's too full of text, something like this, which is really just a paragraph on the screen, isn't really an effective infographic. Okay, so less is more. Try to get your information across as succinctly as possible while still giving the important context. The next important mantra to keep in mind is this idea that visual contrast implies logical contrast. Now what this means is that if something is different, that's what contrast means. If something is visually different, it looks different than everything else, you're implying, if you do it correctly, that there is a logical difference as well. So in this example, the yellow text stands out from the white. Everything else is white. Against the dark background, white has been the predominant font color. So all of a sudden when something is yellow, it draws a visual contrast. Now, if I'm just doing that randomly, that's a problem. That doesn't really give my reader a good understanding of the points I'm trying to emphasize. But if there's a logical difference, if that is more important, or I want to draw a distinction logically, well, the visual representation should do that. That's why we highlight things. That's why we put certain things in bold or underline. Okay, it's a visual contrast implying a logical contrast. So that's important in your infographic as well. Okay. Now, varying font color can add impact to your graphic. So in this example, kind of going along with that same idea, is if everything else is following along in one color and then there's one point that I want to emphasize, just give a little more focus on a different color. I can do that really well. It's very easy, but it tells my reader, hey, pay a special attention to this. Pay attention to everything, but especially this. Okay. However, you can go overboard, right, with font colors. That just makes it too hard to understand. Okay, so the first thing you have to figure out is what is actually going to be visible. You can probably see, but not very well, that there are two sets of text here, right? However, too many font colors are hard to read colors are just distracting, but there's another line that says this color does not have enough contrast because I have a gray letter on a slightly darker gray background. But if it's white, white is contrasted to gray, so that's why we can see it. Same reason we put black ink on white pages. Okay, so depending on what design you want to use for your background, make sure the font goes along with that. Dark background and dark text is not going to work as well. But same thing with a light text and light background is not going to work well. You got to have a difference there. And you also want to make sure you don't go overboard with color changes. This always reminds me of the early days of AOL, America Online, where some people use their screen name to be alternating capital and lowercase letters, which really just gave you a headache. Same thing's going on here. A lot of colors does not mean that your infographic is exciting and really clever. It just means that you're doing way too much. It's way too busy. Okay? So make sure that you use your visual contrast in a logical way. But let's say you've decided, hey, I want to use color to make some different focus, to add a different emphasis. Well, what color are you going to use? Different colors set different moods. That's an important concept. There's a couple of ways to think about this. One way you can think about it is warm versus cool colors. Things like red, orange, yellow typically give us a feeling of warmth. You can imagine why, right? Fire, sunlight, those things are warm, literally. So seeing the colors, even though if I touch that red part of the screen, nothing's going to feel any warmer than the rest of it, visually it gives us that feeling in our mind. Same thing with cool colors like blue, some shades of green, those lighter colors feel cool, right? You think about water, clear why that would be so, right? So you can have that to set certain moods depending on what you're looking for. If something's really intense, a warm color might work. If you want something a little bit more relaxing to represent your data, blue works, and other colors as well. Then there's also symbolic meanings of different colors, right? Red suggests passion, warmth, intensity, right? Things are red. Okay, we feel very strongly about the color red. My guess would be that's because of blood, right? You really only see blood when intense things are happening, when somebody is harmed, right, hurt, and you see a lot of red on places like the battlefield or in a hospital where there's a lot of blood. And you can imagine why that creates passion. But also, when people flush in their face, right, or blushing because of intense feelings or physical activity, you see more red. So it makes sense. Same thing with blue suggesting calm because it's like water, it's like peaceful thing. You think of the color green, that represents nature. Well, why? Well, because a lot of nature is green, leaves, grass, etc. Right? Whereas something like black, we typically think of as a void, like space, or something along those lines, right? Darkness, scariness. Okay. There's reasons for these, right? It's because of what do we associate these colors with. If our blood happened to be neon pink, or if it happened to be orange, well, guess what? Those colors probably would carry those meanings that red does, right? It has to do with our real world, okay? So think about that. Now, another thing to consider is your fonts and your sizes. Obviously, a larger font implies a greater importance. Bold does the same thing and emphasizes something specific as being more important. And having that change in fonts indicates a change in importance. So make sure you're not just using really big font on everything. You want to play around with it to really guide your reader into what are the more important pieces of your infographic, right? You can use the sizes to draw your reader's attention in a certain way. To do that, you also have to think about how viewers view. When we write a paragraph in an essay, we start on the left side of the page, we go to the right side, then we go to the next line, do the same thing over and over. It's very prescribed. It's very easy to do, right? So you have to think about, well, now that I have a lot more freedom with my infographic, how do I want to do it? Well, use that same idea just to give yourself some sense of how your reader's going to view things. We start at the top left and then we move our way down into the right, right? But what happens when you put something at the top but it's on the right, or you put something at the left that's at the bottom, right? Which does the reader's eye go to? Some say the top, some say the bottom because it's at the left. It depends on the reader. So what I would recommend is not doing that, right? Having something that, you want somebody to view it, put it in a place that's logical for them to start, towards the top, towards the left. Not always, but think about how your reader's going to access your graphic, how they're going to flow through your numerous pieces of information. That's important, okay? A few more things to consider. Limit the number of images and keep them simple. You don't want to overdo it, right? As you saw in some of the samples, it's okay to have more than one graph, more than one chart. But if you try to cram too much in, it's going to be cluttered and hard to interpret by the audience, right? Symbolized by this, right? If you look at that office, there's a lot of stuff. But because there's so much, work isn't getting done. So you want something that's a lot more simple, okay? For instance, think about this. This is a nice simple graph that has valuable information, but it's not too much going on the screen, right? So for this graph related to our class, right, this is the finished work. 950 points that have been accounted for. Here's the sliver of the information graphic, so, could make an impact, but as you can see, this is really just the last small piece, the bigger pie that you've already completed, okay? Because the graph is so simple, because the whole graphic is not too cluttered, you can easily understand that as the reader. A few more things. Also, busy backgrounds can distract the audience. I had a student a few semesters ago wrote a paper all about psychedelic drugs, LSD, and using them for therapeutic means. Very interesting. Let's say that student decided, you know what, for my infographic, I want to call back to the time when LSD was first popular. They get tie-dye. Yeah, really all that tells you is that I have a headache. It's really hard to follow your language. A few years ago, I had a student for a different assignment write a paper of biography for Justin Bieber. So in her background on the presentation, it was a picture of Justin Bieber's head. Yeah, it's really hard to read things off of Bieber's head, as you can imagine, or anybody's for that matter, right? The different contours of the face, different shading. So use a simple background, right? Now, something like this, the background that's being used here, there's a little bit of difference, a little bit of design. There's other ones with even more going on that are still simple. You just don't want to go overboard to the fact of making it harder to read than it should be, okay? Because remember, it's all about audience awareness as well as design. Small font's hard to read, so make sure the font's of a good size for your graphic to be easily legible. Okay, you don't want to make your reader squint to try to read your information. And then finally, proofread your graphic. Nothing kills the final polish of your graphic like bad grammar, punctuation, or spelling. As you probably know, there are people online who are self-proclaimed grammar Nazis. I don't know anybody who wants to be any kind of Nazi, calling themselves that, but they go around looking for misuses of there or to, and somebody will make a really good point, really complex, logical statement on social media, and somebody else will say, oh, you spelled there wrong, you're an idiot, which of course is not true, as we know, right? One grammar error doesn't destroy your whole paper, right? That's why in your own essays, I've never failed somebody for a handful of grammar mistakes. But online people are far less forgiving. So you don't have much text, relatively speaking, right? You don't have 4 pages of text in an infographic. So just make sure what you do have is as clean as possible to make it nice and finalized to give yourself a really good presentation, okay? So as you're finishing up your infographic, you want to think about things like layout. How are the things arranged on the screen? You want to think about how those graphs and charts are being used. You want to think about color choices. You want to make sure that everything feels logical and everything contributes to the thesis. Okay, if you can do that, you're going to have a really effective infographic that is both logical and impactful, but also something that's going to be very catchy and really get your message across in a viral way.